the Louisiana Swamplands. Out here, you're either lunch or you're enjoying it. Make sure you end up on top with the all-powerful lineup of Kia SUVs, like the Telluride, Sportage, and Sorento, equipped with available all-wheel drive, higher ground clearance, and the interior capacity to bring everything you need, so you'll always remain more than a gator's length ahead. Visit your local Kia dealer today to find your next adventure in our ever-capable lineup of SUVs. Kia, movement that inspires.
Call 800-3334-KIA for details. Always drive safely.
Meet Zach. His work-life balance is anything but balanced. But when he gets on the bike, he becomes Zen Zach. Zen Zach exists outside of time. His heartbeat sounds like a mellow drum circle.
It's cool, right?
The only notification he hears is the sound of the ocean. So if you want to reach him, talk to the ocean. Zen Zach is so zen because he has 24/7 expert claim service with Geico, which is totally chill. Geico Motorcycle. Expert coverage for both your sides.
Doing that, I was face to face with it. It was holding me by my throat, and it felt like it was sucking something out of me.
I probably should have been more scared than I was when I witnessed the exorcism.
I turned and looked on my right side. When I did, there's a beam on the side of the tree, a large beam. It's looking at me and I'm looking at it.
After I hit the lock button and looked back up, I saw red eyes staring back at me.
That they're going to show multiple gods all over the earth, be able to speak in people's languages, and at that point, it kind of converge into this one entity, which will be revealed as extraterrestrial. You'll realize that aliens are the gods of old, and at that point, it'll wipe religion out of the context of humanity.
No, it couldn't have been a person, I know that. I know that people can't run through the woods like that.
So this thing comes into view, and I see it. It's 50 yards away from me. It's walking on two legs. It's huge. This is a big, hairy-looking being.
Welcome. I'm your host, and this is uNcomfortable. Welcome back to the show. I am your host, Eric Szilagyi. If you've had an uncomfortable experience and you'd like to have it featured on the show, please get a hold of me at contact.uncomfortable@gmail.com. Please make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, both at Uncomfortable Podcast 65. Most importantly, please share the show with others and make sure to leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you can. That is the main way you can help in getting the show out in front of other people. If you've not heard yet, Uncomfortable Patreon has launched, and I'm very excited about it. It is the only place where you will be able to find my video series, Uncomfortable Afterthoughts and A Little Uncomfortable. Go to patreon.com/Uncomfortable Podcast 770 and see if any of the tiers there interest you. Your support for the show so far over the past couple of years has been amazing, and hopefully this will be a way that I can give something back. The link for Patreon and the Uncomfortable Discord will be in the show notes below. As for tonight's guest, he specializes in alchemy, the occult, symbolism, and he has promised to give us some insight into these esoteric topics through an academic lens, if you will, while including some of his theories as well. He says his crazy theories. If you're ready, let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, give a warm, uncomfortable welcome to the host of the Juan on Juan podcast, Mr. Juan Ayala. Juan, welcome to Uncomfortable.
Hey, Eric, how you doing, man? Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Doing
really well, my friend. First of all, before we even get into anything, I owe you a thanks. You have been a a voice of reason. You have been I consider a friend of the show. We've had a number of conversations via messages, and you've always been very supportive. You've shot to the quick of things. You've answered some questions for me. You've pointed me in the right direction. And for that, my friend, I thank you. You've been one of those people in this podcast arena that I consider a friend, and you're good people, man. I appreciate you. Likewise, Eric, and yeah, I think that we're here to help each other out. I mean, there's plenty of room for all of us to grow, and referencing alchemy, my alchemical process might not work for you and vice versa, right? And we're all trying to figure out and navigate whatever this is that we call reality. So yeah, I appreciate it, and I consider you a friend, man. Yeah, absolutely. And anytime you need help, man, just reach out. I'm here to help. Well, it's a blessing of sorts when you run into people. I mean, there's plenty of people out there that are like-minded. And our shows, I would say, are in the same genre, but our niches are definitely on the opposite sides of the room within that genre. No less compelling, no less interesting. It's just it's a different thing, and you do a really good job with what you do. And quite honestly, I mean, your topics interest the hell out of me, but they are to get a good, full understanding, it takes a lot of legwork. And the legwork that I do is more in the paranormal, as far as, experiencing ghosts or spiritual awakenings and, cryptid stuff. Whereas you're more into the stuff that I think most people would probably associate with magic, or and that type of stuff. So I'm really glad that you're here. I'm super interested to hear what you have to say, and I'm sure my fans are gonna eat it up. So what'd you bring for us tonight? Yeah, man, and that's one of the things that it's funny, because when I first got into this, it started with my religious upbringing. A lot of people don't know, but I was born and raised Pentecostal Christian, and I still consider myself a Christian, although maybe not a practicing Christian, if you will. Mm-hmm. I do believe in God. I do believe in a creator. I do believe something is holding this together. And when I started my journey, and I think that for the first, probably, I'm up to episode 160 something at this point, but for the first probably 50 episodes, I was trying to find my footing, taking inspiration from other podcasts that I would listen to. And I just didn't really know how to tackle everything and what I really wanted to talk about. And I think around that area, episode 50 or so, I started to really lock down on my niche. And that was the Gnosticism at first, so religion, and then occult symbolism, and that kind of blended over to magic. And I still don't know where I stand with it, because I think that people have to understand I'm a researcher, and I've always been interested in these fringe topics. I remember as a kid, I would buy at these book fairs the Bigfoot books, and I was into dinosaurs, and I was into all these crazy things. And the Bermuda Triangle was a real big one for me. Absolutely. And aliens and UFOs, just really trying to figure out. I remember watching the shows on History Channel where it'd be like, what was that one show? I think Expedition Unknown or something, where they would go hunting these cryptids, and I go, man, they're going to find something in this episode. And they never did, because that's part of it, right? Like ancient aliens, they talk about the same thing over and over again. And so it really started like that for me, and it kind of evolved, but I never really believed in magic. Now you have magic with a C or magic with a K, which is a Crowley thing, which we can get into in a little bit. But it kind of switched to the occult, then kind of alchemy really started to take over, and that's where I'm currently standing now. And now it's kind of morphing over to the kind of the cryptid side. I mean, I think it's all related. I think that paranormal really falls under, it's like a blanket term, right? And I think that we're all kind of playing in the same waters when it comes to these topics, whether people want to accept it or not. Absolutely. But I think maybe as of lately, Eric, I know you're big into the cryptids. I had a guest on who
I like bringing forth unorthodox ideas. And by unorthodox, I mean thinking outside of the box. And he related in Solomonic magic, which is working with, I guess, demonic entities, if you will, Goetia, which we can get into later, that he started talking about how the barbarous words are like this glossolalia that you're supposed to speak to prepare yourself to work with these entities, right? And he brought forth the idea that this glossolalia sounded kind of sort of like Ron Moorhead's samurai chatter.
Oh, no kidding.
And we brought up, because I know you were on my show as of probably a couple months ago, right?
Yeah.
Where you talked about how these metallic sounds, right? You have Tony Merkel talks about that a lot, and you've talked about on your show, where what if those wood knocks and all these other things are attributed to these entities or these things crossing over into our realm? Like that's a byproduct of these things crossing over.
Coming into our perception, yeah.
Exactly. So he related the barbarous words, which are just not nonsense, but again, nonsense, just bringing forth like whatever comes to mind to disassociate yourself, right? And get into an altered state of consciousness. Because again, you're going to start working with demonic entities essentially, right? And there's some theories we can get into on that, but he linked that to the samurai chatter, and I brought it up on air. And again, I mean, he made a compelling case as far as that being, what if, because I've even done a little bit more research on it, where what if these entities, these cryptids that we know and love, right? Bigfoot, Dogman, Mothman, all these things are brought forth from these other dimensions through the use of the occult and the dark arts. Because as of recently, I did an episode on the Night Side of Eden, Kenneth Grant, which was an occultist. He was a novelist, and he was the personal assistant of Aleister Crowley. And he brought forth the idea of what he called Typhonian teratomas. And it's got to do with this concept that he calls the tunnels of Set. Now, I'm sure you've seen the Tree of Life, right? The Kabbalistic Tree of Life.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of meditative, talismanic instrument that they use to cross over into other dimensions, if you will, right? Psychically, again, I'm not a practicing occultist. I just read about this stuff. But he talked about how in these tunnels, the failed experiments of previous occultists throughout all of history exist within these tunnels. And some of those beings or entities that are in those tunnels are these chimeric looking creatures with different, like again, the harpies or minotaurs and all these things. Now, part of that cosmology, this tree of death that's on the other side, it also can act like a sort of portal into our dimension where these entities can cross over. Now, I always talk about the cinemagicians, and I think that they put these things in Hollyweird or Hollywood, and it's stagecraft, right? William Shakespeare, if he was or wasn't a real person, talked about how the world's a stage, right? And every man and woman has their part and their entrances and exits. Well, stagecraft or cinemagic, whatever you want to refer to it as, I think that life imitates art. So when they put these things, like if you think of the upside down world in Stranger Things, which they have a new season coming out soon, where these entities would come through through these holes in space and time or whatever it was, and it was a reflection of their world that they were living in, except inverted and dark. And if you think of the tunnels of Set, that's exactly what he refers to as this universe B, where again it's a darker aspect where these entities exist. And he brings in, I don't know if you've ever heard of H.P. Lovecraft, but he brings in the Cthulhu mythos into it. He believed that H.P. Lovecraft was in touch with entities from the other side, if you will. And I think he makes a good point, because I think that there's something that I've dubbed interdimensional literature, where there are certain religions, Eric, that don't use vowels. And I've always kid around and I say, well, vowels hold together existence in the fabric of reality. Because for some people, it quite literally does. The Gnostics had certain invocations where they used certain syllables and letters to invoke certain entities and for their magical rituals. So I think that by writing these things down, how H.P. Lovecraft did in all these stories, it solidified itself in our reality, in our dimension. So you have Carl Jung, which was an academic who talked about he had hauntings, and only when he wrote it down and started to journal about them was he able to interact with these entities and like look further down into the fabrics and depths of whatever. That's why I said whatever this reality is, because I think it's malleable to a certain extent. Maybe you have people who are more susceptible to the occultist Monday. You also have.
Do you attribute? You said a lot of stuff right there. Do you attribute? You mentioned that there's some groups that don't use certain letters.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get my thoughts here. Are you saying that, because a lot of people will talk about words and letters spelling being literally that they have power and that they can cast an intent, and that's where the beginning of, or the origins of the word spelling came from.
Do you know what a grimoire is, Eric?
I've heard the name. I could not tell you without some time to like dig back in the deep recesses of my brain, but I do know that I know the word.
So a grimoire is a book of spells, and the word grimoire during the medieval ages, and the word grimoire is where we get grammar from. So our word grammar comes from what means a book of spells.
So there is some tie in there.
The etymology, absolutely, yeah. You can trace it back, yes.
And like, we've heard a lot of people talk about that our existence is one plane of a dimension, and the most common theory is that there are either multiple dimensions that are stacked on top of us or parallel to us, like the pages of a book if you stood it on its end. So if our dimension has a mirrored image of it on the back side of it that would be considered the upside down, that kind of tends to relate to our dimensions being stacked on a horizontal plane rather than a vertical plane. And if that's the case, if that is true, then should we assume that because if every dimension had an upside down to it, then our plane of existence would be sandwiched between two upside downs.
As above,
so below.
So below. Yeah, one of the Hermetic principles. Yeah. I think, yeah, and if you think of a book, I like that analogy. If we look at a reality as a book, you can also, right, so if, let's say reality is stacked on top of each other, and quantum physics, I know some people don't like the word quantum because it's real, it just means something we can't comprehend, whatever. If quantum physics says that there's like 11 dimensions or something or other, well, let's say that it is like a book or a pamphlet, a little bit shorter. And what can you also do with a book? You can you can fold the pages in on itself, and that would account for these wormholes, right? Where space and time curve, and you're able to go through from one side of space and time into the other. I'm sure you've seen that that picture where they draw the wormhole like this, like a C, and then the portal's here, and you just go to the other side. It would make absolute sense to me. But I think that there's something, if you look at, let's take any religious scripture.
It also makes sense that you could skip chapters, which might explain missing time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think that some people are able to do it, and I have some examples of what I believe is this sort of technology, if you will. I'm going to call it technology because I think it is something that we're able to tap into, and they've moved away. I think that religion now is, and again, I believe in God. I do believe that there is a source. What I don't subscribe to is the dogmatic views of religion.
Amen,
and
brother.
How it's a brokered experience now. It's like you can only achieve divinity through us. It's like, no, we don't need these churches to achieve divinity. I think we can do that by ourselves.
We have that in ourselves. Yes.
Reading the word, right? That Jesus became the word, right? So like all these things. But if you think of ancient scripture, and this is what I mean by interdimensional literature, where this scripture, these books, there are entire lifetimes and people who dedicate their entire lives following the doctrines that they find in this one book. and they live, eat, breathe everything what's in that book. And you can, the Quran, the Bible, whatever, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, whatever you want to attribute it. And that's what I mean, because it resonates in space and time and literally changes people's perception. Okay, it changes the way people think, people's outlooks on reality based on this book. And an example that I always use is the King James Version of the Bible. Now, the conspiracy is that it was written by Francis Bacon, and Francis Bacon was William Shakespeare, and William Shakespeare was a fake person. So who was, was it a group of people? Was it a one person? Who was it? Like, we don't really know, but that's besides the point. What I think is happening is that the original alphabet only had like 17 or 18 letters in it, these glyphs, and they added extra letters, these glyphs and symbols that meant nothing essentially until we gave it value. So what I'm proposing is that William Shakespeare, and King James was also a very shady character for those that don't know. He was writing about demonology. He was writing about witches. He was writing about interacting with witches, Sabbaths, all these different things. A lot of people say he was also he was in the closet as well. So there's all these conspiracies revolving around one of the most used versions of the Bible, which people are using things that they don't understand where it comes from, because they only take what is handed to them and they don't do their research. And that's what I love about it, because once you start to peel back the layers through just research and mainstream history, which mainstream history also has its holes and its faults. But point being that a lot of people, without knowing, perhaps William Shakespeare was a pen name for a group of people, or it was a pen name for a different person. But William Shakespeare single-handedly has transformed the English language as we know it today. Now, how do we not know, or how do we know if they didn't do that intentionally in order to bring forth these letters or abstract symbols into our existence that were otherwise magically charged as talismans? Now, when everyone reads that King James Version of the Bible that probably has some alchemical secrets hidden within it, but you're only able to know the secrets if you were initiated, if you were part of that group. And guess what, Eric? It's a big group. It's a big group, and you ain't part of it, or whatever it was that one saying by that comedian, right? Yeah. Unless you're initiated, you're not going to know the esoteric secrets of that book or whatever it is, or right? Because we're only presented the exoteric stuff. That's what they feed the masses, the exoteric, what's on the outside. You read it.
Only what you need to know.
Exactly. So I propose the idea that maybe they did this on purpose and they infiltrated the English language itself. And when you're using these things, right now we're using English, right? Whatever. And it comes from Grimoire, a book of spells. Okay, that's etymology 101. You can look that up right now. Etymology of the word grammar, and it's going to come up for you. Okay. I propose that they did this on purpose. Now, maybe it was to take power away from us and give more power to the church, right? Because we switched from this humanism movement that the microcosm, man as the microcosm, and these occultists, what they strive to was to understand man as a little cosmos. So they wanted to understand man as a little being, right? Everything in and out. And once they were able to understand that, right, as above, so below, they were able to understand the macrocosm, the universe, and on the grander scale. And we moved away from that, right? We moved away from that. It's like, no. You're not a universe within your own self. No. God created the universe, right? You have all these prophets, which you can go down the line. I'm not trying to discredit anyone's religion, but I think it's also a tool. I do think that these people existed, but it's also been used as a tool to control the masses. Absolutely. And then add the demystification of language into that by adding and watering down this what was once a magical language. Down, you water it down, you add more stuff into it to take away its power, because they always say, hey, be careful what you wish for. You're going to manifest these things into existence. Well, I think back then, Eric, I think it was like Harry Potter. I think it was like how they would speak these spells, and there's a reason. And I always think about this, Eric. I go, why is the paranormal a thing? Why is spirituality a thing? Why do all these things exist if reality is just linear and there's nothing else? Nothing happens when you die, nothing else on the other side. There's no such thing as Bigfoot. There's no such thing as Mothman, whatever, Dogman, magic. Then why is it a thing today? Why are we talking about these things today? Why does religion exist? Why does all these things exist if there's perhaps there's truth to it. And perhaps there is this other layer of reality that we're able to tap into that, again, it's subjective. I think if you bring it upon existence, it'll exist. And otherwise, if you want to live under a rock, I think you can shut it out as well. And I think it's all done through language and what they put in the media and these movies, these video games. We're bombarded with all these waves 24/7. I mean, I turned my router off the other day and I felt it. I felt it turn off. It's like, that can't be good for you. You know what I mean? Like, that cannot be good.
Yeah.
And if we take into account that the eye only sees 0.0035 of the light spectrum, that's just the eye. Imagine all the things that we're not seeing. Maybe there is another reality overlaid on top of ours right at this moment. And there are things that are existing in our space right now that we just can't perceive, because I think it goes back to perception and the way that you perceive reality itself. So, and these are rabbit holes I've gone down from the very beginning of hours and hours of research that I've done. And again, it started with religion, Gnosticism. And I think that usually the people who are against the mainstream always get wiped out. And I mean, we know what happened to the Gnostics. They got wiped out because they were getting too close to the truth, if you know what I mean. The authorities come a knocking.
Before you get too far into that, I want to go back and ask you something. You said that like the original alphabet had something somewhere in the neighborhood of 17, and then there were other things added. Were those the other letters that were added? Were they added to dilute, or were they added to, or do they have some power associated with them, and by us using them unknowingly, it's aiding? Which way is right? Which way am I thinking is right?
That's it. So you're onto it. You understand it, but that's where I don't know if it was to empower us even further, right? Or if it was, because there's a thing called, there's a concept, which I'm not going to get into, but there's a concept called Pythagorean palaces. Now, essentially what it is within that concept, that's a whole 3-hour podcast on its own, but within that concept, there's something called occulted scaffolding. And essentially it was that architects back then were magicians. Physicians were magicians as well. Like all these things, and the reason the architect as magician, the reason that they looked at him as a magician was because he had to divinate. He had to, when they were building the foundation of a building, he had to look into the future, 100 years, 50 years, whatever it was. So therefore he was practicing divination by looking into the future to see if that foundation would hold the weight of that building. Okay. And during the Renaissance, I mean, magic and buildings were one and the same. It was all intertwined. Buildings and these cathedrals were talismans, and which we can get into that a little bit later. But point being that part of that process was that the architect would draw these occulted lines. So an occult scaffolding, and think of it when an architect does his sketch. And they put or when somebody's doing a sketch of something and they put those lines as references, right? That's the occultist scaffolding, because after he's done with those lines, he erases them. Mm-hmm. So in the magical sense of occulted scaffolding, the intention that goes into making something originally is that occulted scaffolding. So you don't know if when they introduce these glyphs or these symbols into the language, what that magician's intention was. Okay, implying that William Shakespeare was this great occultist or Francis Bacon was this great occultist. Now, there is evidence that suggests that he did know about the occult. Okay, he wrote Tempest, for example, right? We have all these occult aspects in William Shakespeare's plays. And where did he get his occult knowledge from? There's another conspiracy saying that he traveled around with John Dee and Edward Kelly during the 16th century around Europe, and he learned all his magical knowledge from John Dee, the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, which we know John Dee was in touch with Enochian entities. On the other side, they were scrying in this crystal ball, talking to these aliens, angels, demons, whatever you want to call it, but they were talking to something outside of the, existence as we know it. So back to the occultist scaffolding, we don't know what they charge these things with. And that's why you have to be very careful with whatever you're ingesting, watching on TV. A lot of these shows have a lot of occult aspects, and the Superb Hour or Super Bowl, when they do all these rituals, right, this occult symbolism that's in these things that we're observing, it doesn't matter if you don't believe in it, Eric, or you don't understand it, because the elites understand it and they use these systems accordingly. They don't pick these colors because, right? They don't pick these certain colors for these certain teams and all these different things. No. The logos for these teams are sigils. And part of creating a sigil, and this gets into chaos magic, is charging that sigil. And it doesn't matter if you don't believe it, Eric, as a person, because your soul believes it. And that's what they're after. As long as your soul body, your soul, your subconscious understands it and resonates with it, they've already done their work.
Okay, so I'm going to play the devil's advocate on this. And I'm going to go back to my childhood growing up listening to bands like Kiss. Okay. The crazy makeup and the loud music and, 3 notes get you, 800 million albums sold. Marilyn Manson, Motley Crue, the list goes on forever. Has that always been the case that what you're talking about, that stuff's being put in front of us? Or did it originally start off as just theatrical shock value? This is completely different. Let's get people, even if you don't like us, you're still paying attention to us. Was that always the case, or has that progressed now into the people that are using it today during the Super Bowl and different music videos and, some of the stuff? I mean, I tend to look at things, I can remember my dad, asking me, because my first couple of albums that I ever bought the first one was Kiss Alive, which was a great live album. The other one was Elton John's Yellow Brick Road. And then the next one was probably Ozzy Osbourne's first solo album. And I can remember my dad sitting down. It was almost from the standpoint of like you were getting ready to have the talk, about sex. But he was like, he wanted to know what I saw in bands like Kiss and Ozzy. And I was like, I grew up loving horror movies and UFOs and Bigfoot and all that stuff was always a part of my life. So when I listened to Ozzy or I listened to Kiss, it was almost like a horror movie in my head set to good rock music, right? And then he was like, and what about Elton John? You realize that he's a little off, right? Meaning with his sexuality. And I'm like, well, yeah, the guy's got a great voice and he had a lot of good songs, I didn't care that it was, but I guess the point that I'm getting at is I always looked at that kind of stuff through the eyes of, it was like a horror movie set to music, good music I wanted to listen to. Was it the same back then? Was it less nefarious back then and more geared just to shock people and get attention? And then now they have found that it is it's a good venue. It's a good avenue for them to get their message out. And at what point do you are there people out there that are using it still that way just to get attention and just to be like, hey, look at me, I'm doing stupid shit, using all this imagery. And then, then you have the ones that are making a serious effort to get that in front of us. That was a long-winded way of getting around what I was trying to say, but it's not really an easy question, I guess.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you 100%. I do think it goes back since as far as we know, I believe that plays, right? It goes back to the William Shakespeare, the world's a stage. And if we're susceptible to this stagecraft, if we will, then yeah, I do think, right, how I said architect as magician, you have composer as magician, and there are books about how certain frequencies, and when you know about cymatics, I mean, where you play a certain tone and it forms a certain shape. Yeah. Well, that's a real thing. Cathedrals back then, cathedrals were used with this, the stained glass, the organs inside there's a reason why it's named an organ, right? Because again, they believed that there was a colossus inside these buildings, and a cathedral was there to invoke a spiritual experience, an epiphany, if you will. Why? Because when it comes to pictorial magic, which is the use of images, the regular layperson only understands symbols, right? Some people, right? Here are picture words. What do they show little kids? Picture words. Why? Because they don't understand anything else. If you have them read a book about the occult, they're not going to be able to read it. So therefore, these occultists, and I'm using cathedrals as an example because it's an actual thing, they would put these images on these cathedrals to bring the peasant class in and draw them into, let's say, this peasant who doesn't know any better, right? They're just there to till the fields and pay taxes. Well, they have to go to church every Sunday or whatever day of the week it is. They go into these buildings and they have a spiritual awakening. And the people at the forefront, the preacher, the priest, or whoever it is telling them like, hey, you see, you experience that? Well, that's what God is. And therefore, we're that middleman between you and God. So therefore, you have to come.
When in reality, the frequencies that were being generated by the organ playing in the architecture, the way it was specifically designed, the lighting that was coming through the stained glass windows that were perpetuated just specifically to incite a momentous occasion for somebody at that right moment when the sun was coming through and the vibrations were hitting you from the music that was being played and the way it reverberated off of the walls and the angles and everything. That was the spiritual awakening, and man standing up there at the altar was basically taking
it's all about energy.
Taking Eric. Ownership of being the one that produced it.
Yeah, so where attention goes, energy flows, right? So, and I'm using this as an example to relate it to modern day concerts and music, where, back then a lot of the cathedrals were built by the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar were allegedly alchemists. They don't know where all the gold came to build these cathedrals. There was too much gold, right? Somebody did the math. They're like, there's the amount of gold and the amount that it would take to build these cathedrals. And why build all these cathedrals? Well, they were trying to quite literally transmute reality and the world through the use of these cathedrals. Now, we get into alchemy. This is why I study alchemy so much, because I do think any exchange of energy, and the Knights Templar were the ones who invented the modern day banking system. And the Knights Templar were also accused of worshiping Baphomet. I'm sure you know who Baphomet is.
Sure.
Right? Everyone knows who that is. We know about the famous depiction of Eliphas Levi, which was a famous occultist. But the Knights Templar were said to worship this entity. Now, that's a whole different thing. But the fact that our modern day banking system was supposedly given to the Knights Templar through the use of this demonic entity. I mean, right? They say it's the root of all evil. Well, I think that there is some truth to that. Because think about it. If a demonic entity prophesies to these Knights Templar, because that's part of the lore of these daemons or whatever you want to call them, that they prophesize for you, that they divinate for you, that they tell you secrets, except it's that Faustian pact. Right? What are you willing to give up, Eric, for all the knowledge in the world?
I don't need to know. I don't need to know that much.
It always wants your soul, right? It wants you to sacrifice people up. And I think even till this day, these secret societies exist And I do think that they're tapping into otherworldly energies, if you will. And Eric, there are what I'm talking about with this subtle energy of, because not only does the going to church and all these places, it also plays into the idea of egregores, thought forms, composer as magician. Like, there's books I can share with you on this that I'm not just pulling this out of where. There's actual, I've read about, like, there's actual occultists who have written about these things. And that's why I said it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. They don't care, because they use it to their advantage. And I think what it is, it's a way of glitching, not so much that we're in a simulation, but for a lack of a better term, glitching this matrix, which we are a part of. Now, if it is an actual computer simulation, that's a whole nother debate, but maybe it's an organic simulation. Maybe it's some sort of, not so much a computer-based holographic reality, how they put it in the Matrix, but maybe it's an organic one. Who knows? I mean,
maybe we're all still just a bunch of monkeys who found a big old batch of mushrooms.
Well, listen,
and what we're experiencing as our lives is actually what's going on in the head of a chimp who is high as hell off of psilocybin.
So it's funny you bring up the ape, because the divine ape is a thing to these occultists. Now, and this is where we can get into the cryptid aspect of it, because I think it all ties back to alchemy, where in alchemy, there are certain grimoires, and I talk about the homunculus a lot. And what the homunculus is it's Latin for little man.
Now let me interrupt you real quick, because I'm going to prejudice myself by saying that I'm an idiot when it comes to homunculus, because my only understanding of homunculus is a CD experimentation with basically male semen and some tin foil and maybe a battery or some other weird shit, and then it sits in its little incubating tray and apparently starts moving on its own and everything. That is my only understanding of the word homunculus. But obviously I have enough respect for you to know that would not be why you refer to yourself as the homunculus, because that would be like shooting yourself in the foot. So whatever you're going to tell me is going to be an eye-opening experience on the subject of the homunculi.
So yeah, I was labeled the homuncologist or homunculist, however you want to say it. But yeah, that's the alchemical homunculus. I mean, you're not off. But, and this is what I love about alchemy, that it exists on different layers of reality, right? Alchemy is a biological thing. It's a physiological thing. It's a psychological thing. I call it it's an interdimensional subject, because part of the magnum opus of alchemy, and the magnum opus is the great work, which I think that the Freemasons and all these other secret societies, they're all about the great work and quite literally transmuting reality itself. Because when you achieve the magnum opus, right, when the alchemist is in his cave somewhere trying to transmute lead into gold and find the philosopher's stone or the elixir of life, there's a reaction that happens. And the light from that reaction transforms the DNA of that alchemist, and that alchemist is able to transcend reality itself. Now, sounds like a bunch of woo-woo, right? Well, the last great alchemist, quote unquote, was Fulcanelli, and he was as recent as 1924. A man who knew about the secrets of nuclear weapons years before the Manhattan Project.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, this is a guy, I did an episode on it, Shadow Band Syndicate number 2, I believe, with the guys from Kill the Mockingbird podcast. A shout out to Joel and Sean.
Sean Chris, yeah.
Yeah, so we did an episode on him, and yeah, goes as far back as 1924, I believe, is when he disappeared, because he had achieved the magnum opus. But point being that it can be a physical thing, or it can be a spiritual thing. because the idea of the homunculus goes back as far back as 3600 BCE to the Taoists. Now, the Taoists believe that through meditation, they could quite literally impregnate themselves. Okay. Now it's gonna get weird, Eric. Okay. It's gonna get a little weird. So just bear with me. Okay. The reasoning behind their meditation, the chi, the way is what they call it, this force. You wonder where George Lucas or George Ophiuchus, as I like to call him, gets all their ideas, where Hollywood gets their ideas from. They get them from these ideas that I'm about to present to you, where this way, this force that exists that we don't really know what it is, but they believe that we all are outpouring this energy through our head and through our body and all the chakras, if you will, right? And through meditation, you're able to reverse this energy in on itself. And through abstinence and semen retention, right, if you want to believe in all that, they believe that they could create within themselves this little crystallized golden little man, okay, that would be projected out from their body. Now, if that's an actual thing that happened, I don't know. Again, this is where we can get into speculation, because part of the homunculus lore as well is that any homunculus that is set out in the wild grows to be mythological creatures like a gnome or a giant or perhaps a Bigfoot or dogman, who knows, right? I mean, they grow into old age and they turn into these mythological creatures. But the purpose that little golden man served for that monk was to exist in this reality for him to be able to escape samsara. So there was a little piece of him existing in this reality. Therefore, when his body died off, he wouldn't have to reincarnate again, because this little golden man was running around for him in this dimension, if you will. So they figured out a way essentially to hack the matrix and escape reincarnation. Okay. So fast forward, right? You have Egypt, 2nd, 3rd century. You have the alchemical homunculus, because I think it's linked to this idea of the guy who invented the binary code that is running through our computer right now. Let's go back a little bit before that. Charles Babbage, the father of the modern day computer, he tried to summon the devil at one point in his life, and he wrote about this. So again, it goes back to these things that we use today. We don't know what their original intention was, except that we use it today. The internet originated at CERN. We know all the theories behind CERN. They're trying to tap in the World Wide Web. WWW is 666. That's like elementary stuff. Like, oh, www. I think that the internet is another realm, another dimension. Okay, quite literally another dimension, right? When you log into something, you log into a portal. If we go back to the idea that grammar equals grimoire, they put these things in there intentionally. It's all magical, right? Our language is magical. So you log into a portal to get into your Instagram or your Facebook or something. You're tapping into this other realm.
And it literally exists nowhere other than on the screen.
And it's autonomous. It exists whether you're on it or not.
But you can go back to, and you can find things that you found before.
Yes.
You can take parts of you and put it in there.
Yes.
And you'll be there forever.
Yes. That's why certain indigenous cultures didn't believe in taking their picture, because they believed that their soul was trapped in that picture for eternity.
Right.
So, Charles Babbage, he wrote about how his reasoning behind creating or contributing to the development of the computer was to prove the existence of God. He wanted to prove the supernatural through technology, which I think that is linked to the transhumanistic movement. And again, you can fact check me all you want for those listening. You can look all this up yourself. Now, if we go back to Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which is the father of binary code, the ones and zeros that are in your computer right now, he's the one that invented that. He had something called monadology.
The Louisiana swamplands. Out here, you're either lunch or you're enjoying it. Make sure you end up on top with the all-powerful lineup of Kia SUVs, like the Telluride, Sportage, and Sorento, equipped with available all-wheel drive, higher ground clearance, and the interior capacity to bring everything you need, so you'll always remain more than a gator's length ahead. Visit your local Kia dealer today to find your next adventure in our ever-capable lineup of SUVs. Kia, movement that inspires.
Call 800-333-4KIA for details. Always drive safely.
Doesn't that sound refreshing? Why not take it up a notch and make it a Dunkin' Refresher? If you're a Dunkin' Rewards member, you can get a $3 medium Dunkin' Refresher every day all month long. That's a lot of refreshment, and it's pretty refreshing. Not a member? Join on the Dunkin' app. Dunkin' Rewards. Save them, stack them, use them how you want. America runs on Dunkin'. Limit 1 per member per day. Additional charges and terms may apply. Exclusions may apply. Participation may vary. Limited time offer.
Meet Zach. His work-life balance is anything but balanced. But when he gets on the bike, he becomes Zen Zach. Zen Zach exists outside of time. His heartbeat sounds like a mellow drum circle.
It's cool, right?
The only notification he hears is the sound of the ocean. So if you want to reach him, talk to the ocean. Zen Zach is so zen because he has 24/7 expert claim service with Geico, which is totally chill. Geico Motorcycle, expert coverage for both your sides.
And monadology was the idea of encapsulating God into a substance, into something physical, into a being. So taking God and bottling him up in a bottle or something, right? Because they wanted to be able to tap into those powers. Essentially, it's about becoming a god in this dimension or this realm. Yeah. This is what these occultists want to do. So how does this relate to the homunculus? That's essentially what a homunculus is. It's a little magical man created through alchemy that occultists would use in order to obtain godlike powers. Now, this sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, something out of this world, quite literally.
It does, and it makes me want to ask you, has there ever been any evidence of an actual homunculi?
In what sense, Eric?
Like in a non-metaphysical sense, in a very physical sense. Has there ever been evidence of something that has evidence of its own life?
Yeah. What do you think IVF is? They make babies and test tube babies. I mean, we can use that example. They quite literally grew a lamb in an artificial matrix, which matrix means womb as of recently. They've talked about making chimeras. In 2019, there was a debate about mixing monkey DNA with chicken DNA or something of that nature, and they had to destroy it after 14 days, allegedly, but they did destroy it. These are alchemists today. Manly P. Hall talks about how the alchemist of old is, he changed his cave and his robe into a white lab coat and 4 walls. That's all it is. Trust the science is trust the seance, whatever way you want to put it. I mean, it's another form of religion. And I think that they're doing the same thing that they were doing 1,000 years ago. They're doing it today, except under controlled environments, if you will. So now, Crowley, the guy we all know and love, Crowley, one of the great B666, one of the, I'm not going to say greatest because I hate that guy, but one of the more well-known occultists also wrote about homunculus in the 19th century, the early 1900s, 20th century, the early 1900s. He wrote about how to create a homunculus. Jack Parsons, the founder of JPL Laboratories, the guy who allegedly made the fuel for the rockets to reach the moon, who also was in bed with L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. They tried to create a homunculus.
In bed literally or in bed figuratively?
There are some people that say quite literally, yes. And they did the Babylon working ritual in the middle of the desert, trying to invoke this homunculus. And some people say that he did succeed. Marjorie Cameron, his second wife, who also went on to try and create a moon child, which is another form of the homunculus. And she had an interracial orgy sex cult, which they would try to invoke because they were Crowleyans, the Crowleyites. They were trying to create, Crowley wrote about the moon child, which is this story about 2 different secret societies, the White Lodge versus the Black Lodge, who were fighting over an unborn child. because again, the magical systems, Eric, change over time to fit the practitioner's needs. So the subject of the homunculus has changed the way it's looked upon. And as far as at the Trinity site, at the Land of Enchantment along the 33rd parallel, James Shelby Downard wrote about how there was this big jumbo, this big, huge round cylinder that we don't know what the government made it for, but it was present at the first nuclear detonation. And he proposed the idea that they were trying to radioactively make a homunculus. This is the mid-1900s. And the government was allegedly involved in trying to create homunculus. They were watching Jack Parsons, who was also a very avid Crowley follower, who was trying to quite literally bring forth the end of the world, Ragnarok, whatever, the apocalypse, whatever you want to call it, through the use of sex magic and trying to birth a homunculus into this reality. So this idea, I believe, is live and well. And also as recent, I linked it, what I've termed the Epsteinian homunculus, where you had Jeffrey Epstein's Zorro Ranch in the Land of Enchantment, so New Mexico, near the 33rd parallel. He had a 33,339 square foot ranch, which numbers to them is important, Eric, because it's a way that they're able to glitch the matrix, and it plays into the Pythagorean palace idea, where they're able to encapsulate higher dimensions into buildings. Okay, different Masonic lodges are built along these certain principles. That's why they revere Pythagoras, because all is number. I do believe all is number, and that's a way of tapping into something higher in this reality. But Jeffrey Epstein supposedly was trying to impregnate 30 women at the same time in his Zorro Ranch. Now, that may be like, oh, well, he was just trying to bring forth his seed into this world. Well, the problem with that is that I'm familiar with the recipe that Crowley wrote in order to create what I've dubbed the Crowleyan homunculus. And a circle, a consecrated circle is needed in various geometric shapes. And when you look up Jeffrey Epstein's Zorro Ranch, outside of that ranch, in the middle of the desert, which is also part of the recipe, because no wise spirit would be wandering the desert. We know that in the desert, weird things happen. The jinn live in the desert. We know Jesus was tempted by the devil in the desert. In these open areas, right? These open swamps where they say Bigfoot or the skunk ape exists and all these different cryptids, right? Strange phenomenon.
Liminal abysses.
Yes. It was in the middle of nowhere, right? This ranch was in the middle of nowhere, tucked into, right, in the Land of Enchantment, New Mexico, tucked in these mountains. And outside the ranch, if you Google Earth it, you can look this up, there's a huge circle on the outside of it. Now, part of the Crowleyan homunculus is procreating during certain astrological alignments in a ceremonial fashion. So again, sex magic. To birth, now, it's going to be a regular human being, except the spirit or soul is going to be different. And it doesn't matter if you believe that or not. They believed it. Okay. Now, part of the homunculus lore, and I'm sure you're aware of, go ahead.
You've said this several times. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. They believe it. And I think that's an important thing. You keep saying it, and I'm afraid listeners are going to be like, oh, he's being cocky, or he's being aloof. But that's what you're saying is very much a true statement. It doesn't matter if you believe it. It's that they do believe it, and there's power in that belief.
Exactly. But the reason I say it is because what I'm saying also sounds crazy, Eric. Sounds wild. Sounds like something out of a sci-fi, but it goes back to phenomenology, where the experience, as long as it's real to you, you saw Bigfoot, Eric. Nobody can take that away from you. You know what you saw. And it's my job to either believe you or not believe you. So that's why I say they believe it. They believe it with every inch of their soul, whatever, with every ounce of their soul, whatever it may be. They believe, and that's why I keep reiterating, because I'll follow it up with some crazy statement that I just said. It's like, remember, it sounds crazy, but the truth is stranger than fiction. Okay, right? We're showing all these things in these movies. Look at what's that that one guy that wrote Rosemary's Baby, I forget his name, that POS, he wrote about, right, doing sexually depraved things to a young lady in order to birth the son or the Satan's baby.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? He got arrested for what?
Roman Polanski. Yeah.
Yeah. What did he get arrested for, Eric? Exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a 12-year-old girl, was it?
You got it. So, and why is that, Eric? Because they take these ideas and it's the revelation of method, which Crowley wrote about that. So they'll take these stories, this fiction, and they'll put it in a medium based on true events. But it's okay if you know that or not know that. But again, I'm just using that as an example. I believe that the story of Moonchild, if you ever read it, written it was published in 1950 something, I believe, or 1940 something. I believe that's based on true events, that they did try and evoke this homunculus into existence. Because again, it's this idea of taking these quote unquote stories and just putting them into, make it a story. People are not going to know any better, but you're reading and you're putting your energy into it. And that's what they want.
You know, when you talked about that, you said there were two warring factions going against each other, you know, but to my simple mind, when you say Moonchild, I'm assuming that there's, are we talking about these two different factions were extraterrestrial? Were they unidentified entities or were they actual a group of practicing humans that were practicing different types of magic or
Well, do you know what one of the main texts of Thelema is, the Book of the Law? Do you know how Crowley got that?
No.
Through contact with an extraterrestrial.
Really?
Yeah. Their entire religion is based on automatic writings of being able to supposedly tap in. They were tapped into something. Now that's why they bring Cthulhu's, H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos into it, because one of the things that's very interesting about chaos magic, which all these people were chaos magicians now, chaos, the name chaos magic, you think, oh, chaos. Well, you know, unorganized, just disaster, right? You can't comprehend it. No. Chaos magic is quite literally the opposite of what you're thinking about. It's organization beyond your comprehension. Something, right? They say order out of chaos all the time. We heard that through the riots of, right?
Well, they associate that with the Big Bang.
Yeah. So the idea that organization beyond comprehension that will drive you quite literally insane. So the concept of chaos magic, to put it in layman's terms, and this is why it's very powerful and dangerous at the same time, because chaos magic, their whole thing is throwing out all the ceremonial mumbo jumbo and getting straight to the point. Cutting out all these rituals and all, no. We don't need any of that. We get straight to the point. We do the magic as soon as, open up the can, plug and play, good to go. Now, why is that dangerous? That's dangerous because they can quite literally use that in whatever ceremony, right? The Super Bowl, they do weird stuff in the Super Bowl. Well, that's a form of chaos magic. And they'll invoke certain gods for one purpose and then get rid of them. So they'll invoke Cthulhu, which is the main deity of the Cthulhu mythos, and use them as their main god for whatever ritual, and just chuck them right out. Because they're able to assign certain things to certain rituals for their need at that one point in time, and then they're done with it. So think about that concept. If they're able to tap into that whenever, Eric, in your movies, and also one more thing that's important. So we're talking about an artificially created person through a group of people, right? Or a person, an alchemist, or an occultist, however you want to say it. What is this world ruled by? Corporations, right? What does every corporation have? They have a logo. Do you know the etymology of corporation? What corporation quite literally means? And you can look this up right now. Anybody listen to me right now. Corporation quite literally means an artificially created persons by a group of people. So you asked me, where's their homunculus concept? Again, let's take the meat and bones alchemical homunculus out of the equation. I went from this metaphysical Taoist homunculus, the little golden man, and then it got transformed into a meat and bones where they would take their semen, put it in this vessel, in this matrix, and create this little person that they would then, Eric, vivisect or dissect or destroy and use its various body parts for magical powers. Now, I'm not making this up. There are grimoires that I've read that show you, and they have the instructions on how to create these homunculus. And they are depraved, Eric. Now, some people will argue with me like, oh, it's all symbolic, Juan. It's all symbolic. Absolutely. But tell that to the uninitiated guy who is trying to obtain godlike powers, that one Florida man who is going to go and actually try and do those rituals and ceremonies for real, following the recipe that was given to him in the grimoire. You see what I'm getting at? Like, even right, the secret society created that and they shrouded it in symbology. Okay. What about the regular layman that runs across it, that wants to obtain, again, that Faustian pact? What are you willing to do for all the power in the world? We hear about this all the time in the music industry, where they sell their soul to the devil and they do all these rituals and all these things. There's rappers rapping about that they're going to die before 21 and then they die before that age or whatever it was, right? We hear about it all the time. So, again, I don't find it too far-fetched. I do think that the truth is stranger than reality. I think that we live in a sci-fi world, and some people are more open to it than others. And I think this is where religion comes into play. I think religion is again, religion is magical too, Eric. Okay, so I think that religion is the good magic, if you will, because let's be real. All right, the stories of Jesus Christ walking on water, turning water into wine, all these different things, that's magical to me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very heretical to say, but he might have been an adept who was tapping into, who knows? But we can't deny the fact that it was magical. That it was magic what he was doing, healing the sick. Come on.
Most of the Holy Spirit. Most of the events that took place in the Bible are magical.
So you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We are talking about a metaphysical aspect of reality that, again, one of the main patrons or deities, if you will, deity of one of the greatest religions in the world right now, which I consider myself a Christian, is Jesus Christ. And he was using magic for the betterment of people. But it's like how they put in these movies. The Force, you can tap into it and use it for what? For good?
It's around you. It runs through you.
You're either a Jedi or you're a Sith. And I mean, again, that comes from all these occult texts, Eric. They're reading the same things that I'm reading and what I'm researching and what I'm trying to bring awareness to people about. They're using these things against people. But now, that's why I kept saying, it doesn't matter if you don't believe it, because they do. Because if we go back again to it doesn't matter if you want to believe me or not. I believe that they're using these things in the way that I've said. And
are they all legitimately using it, or are there posers out there? I mean, with as deep as you get into this stuff, are you able to watch something on TV, say, whether it's in the Super Bowl or whether it's in a the Weeknd's music video or something? Are there people out there that you can recognize that they're using it to gain popularity or get attention, and not using it for its intended purpose, versus those that are using it for an actual reason?
Yeah, I do think that there are people that tap into it and try to use it for their benefit. I haven't practiced the occult, but I've done certain things. For example, you have Vitruvius, who talks about any sensible treaty is 216 pages long. Well, the number 216, for example, I have an Occultus Mundi, a journal that I publish. I'll do the columns 216 points apart, right? 33 is a very famous number we all know and love. Well, I'll put maybe 33 fonts for this title, whatever it is. Again, so I resonate with that energy, and my thing that I'm putting my art, because life imitates art, I'll put that in. That's as far as I've gone, but I do know of people who have used these things.
But your intent behind the Monday is for education and for good.
Yes. And again, that's where I change versus an occultist who's doing it for a selfish gain. But there is also, right, and I'm going to reference one of my favorite animes, Full Metal Alchemist, which has a whole bunch of truth in it. I'm going to use the law of equivalent exchange, which is a thing in that show where you have to give something up of equal or lesser value for what you want. So take that into consideration, because I know people who have tried these things, and by these things I'm talking about the occult, magic with a C or a K, whatever, and it's backfired on them because you can't just take. You got to eventually give something back. And it goes back to that Faustian pact. It's like, what are you willing to give up for all the knowledge in the universe? Are you willing to give up your soul? Are you willing to, we hear it all the time. Oh, so-and-so sacrificed their mom. Kanye West sacrificed his mom. So-and-so sacrificed their daughter. We hear about this all the time. So just extrapolate that out and go, okay, this is where that concept comes. It comes from the occult. Now, we don't know what sort of magical system they're using. They could be using their own system, for all we know. Because, again, it's about tapping into it. It exists there already. You tap into it and you use it. Like the Spear of Destiny, you can either use it to kill people, or you can use it, a pen. You can use it to stab somebody. You can use it to write a check. I don't know, something good for somebody. You know what I mean? Like something good. So, and that's where the dualistic aspect of existence really comes into play. It's like, are you going to be a good guy? Or are you going to be a bad guy? And I think that's what religion serves a purpose, to give people a foundation and guide certain people who need that guidance. Again, I'm not saying religion is all bad, because like I said, I consider myself a Christian, but I think some people go above and beyond and overboard with it. And I think that's where I draw the line. I don't believe in pushing my beliefs upon other people. And I talk about these things that I'm talking about today, like the occult, to educate people who otherwise wouldn't have known. And you're absolutely right. My show gets pretty heavy, and there are some sophisticated concepts in there, and it's not for everybody. It doesn't resonate for everybody, but those who it does resonate with, they find a lot of value in it, because again, we go hard in the paint, as I like to say on my show, and I'll hold back as far as saying vulgar things, because there are darker aspects of the occult, which, I mean, use your imagination. They've done it all. I mean, Crowley, there's stories of him you can look up yourself. Yeah. But, I'll draw the line there as far as getting into detail with that, but it does exist. I mean, there is that aspect of the occult that is very dark. And I mean, sometimes, man, my mind will wander, or I'll see things on the corner of my eye where I'll have to invoke the name of Jesus, and it works. Because again, I'm looking at it from an academic lens, where I'm not here to use this against anybody. And when I open myself up, there are these, I've heard these things referred to as a portal, these books. Right, when you open up this book, it's a portal to whatever, and you can open up yourself to certain things. So I always keep that in mind, and I don't burn sage or anything, but I'll pray and be like, hey, God guide me or watch over me, whatever it is, because it does get dark and heavy, and yeah, I mean, it's a real thing. So I'm here to do the dirty work for people, as I like to say, and so they don't have to go through that.
It's interesting that you segued into that and brought that up, because that has been a topic that has come up recently with me. I think I can most recently reference back to the episode I did with Steve and Kyle from the Hollow Sky. I had him on my show. I had no intent to go down this road. It was, my show. It's not scripted. I don't sit here with a list of questions that I'm going to ask. It's conversation based. But man, 5 minutes into it, and I think I was already thinking in my head, man, I'm going to need to apologize to these guys, because it became a dark episode in that we talked a lot about the weight that is put on us by ourselves for deciding what we do, But, the conversations that we have with people, I spoke with one guy, Joey, who was, an ex-military, and man, he just laid it all out, about how he tried to kill himself, and the terrible, terrible things that he saw when he wasn't successful, but they were still trying to get him to finish the job, basically. And, I talked to so many people who have, not good spiritual experiences, whether it be oppressive entities or, things of that sort. And, sitting here facilitating the conversation is one thing, but I don't know that everybody does it, but I always try to look through the lens of the eye of the person that's telling me the story. And when you do that, it does become very heavy, and it can be dark, man. You can, I'll get done with, a certain guest, and, there's been times where even after the recording is done, I'll continue to have conversation with that person. I'm not the guy that's gonna, have you on my show and then never have time to talk to you again. I don't think that's good. If you're gonna come on my show and, show me the courtesy of and the respect of telling your story to my fans, my listeners, I'm going to do you the same, and I'll continue. And, unless you cross a line and you make it an uncomfortable thing, then I won't. But, and there's, I don't want to use the word dumping, but that's almost what it's like is, you get the weight of these people's stories and the emotional trauma that they've gone through because of these things. And, not all of them are necessarily paranormal. I mean, there's some that, after you're done with the talk and you go back and you look at it, there's obviously some kind of childhood trauma, or, there's screen memories that they've thought it was easier to talk about being abducted by an extraterrestrial than to come out and admit that, there might have been some kind of sketchy shit going on when they were a kid, and, neighbor Joe down the road got a little too handsy. And, I mean, this is one of the reasons I just recently reached out to BetterHelp I want to get them as a sponsor because, I did Manscaped, and, Manscaped is fun. It's hilarious. And, you're shaving man parts, and, it was fun, but it doesn't help anybody, and the more and more I get into this, I want to be able to offer something like BetterHelp, online, it's private, you're anonymous, and, people can get some sort of mental health help. And when I say mental health, I'm not saying that they're crazy or that they have, mental issues, but these people need to be able to have somebody to talk to. And us as a host of a podcast, I'm willing to do it, but I'm not trained for it. I don't have the resources to give somebody to help, help that healing journey. And I'd like to have something like that to be able to offer people. But yeah, you're right. And it's a heavy thing, and it's people, it's topics, it's, when I think I did an episode here recently, and it's like, man, when you start looking into the dark and your eyes finally get acclimated and you can see better, you see things looking back at you. And that's 100% no bull right there. You do see things looking back at you. They're not necessarily interested in you. They're not necessarily after you, but they are going to let you know, we see you looking,
one of the things that I experienced for a long time, and I haven't experienced it in a while, but one of the things that I experienced for a long time was sleep paralysis. Now, I experienced the paralysis of it for years. I mean, for quite, I want to say at least 5 years, because I remember it happening. My son is 5 now, and I remember it happening well before he came into this world. But I would never have. I'd have the sense of dread. I would have the sense of something's gonna kill me, right? You can't really breathe. You're trying to jerk yourself out of it. And I got to the point where I was able to bring myself out, you know, with and then you kind of come forward, and you kind of just okay. But I would feel the sense of dread, but I wouldn't see the entities. I wouldn't see how some people say the hag sitting on their chest or whatever it is. But I would feel that sense of dread, right? And that sense of helplessness that you feel when you're in that position, because it almost feels like you. And I remember I had a waking dream one time where I could have swore I got up, sat on the side of my bed, and sometimes I'll sit there right in the mornings I hate waking up early, so I got to collect myself. I get up too quickly. I got a headache, you know. And I sat up, and I was just kind of holding my head, and then the next thing I know, I was laying down again, and I was getting right back up again. I was like, wait, what in the world? So again, maybe it was a waking dream, maybe I astral projected, who knows? I mean, I don't know, but it's funny you bring up this aspect of the darker aspect of the psyche, because one of the Hermetic principles is all is mental. Now, and this segues directly into what I want to talk to you about as far as a dogman and all these things, because Crowley believed that these demons, these darker entities, was our psyche. Carl Jung talked about the dark self, right? The shadow self, and how that shadow self would reveal all the secrets in the world to you. Now, at what cost? I don't know, but point being that Crowley talked about these demons, this Goetia, being us. It's just aspects of our own psyche that we're tapping into, and we're bringing these things forward. And we've always been painted in the media that people who are schizophrenic, that they're sick, that they're they need medicine. But what if schizophrenic people are just wired differently, and they're in tune with these things in their head that, right, there's the bicameral mind theory, where back then, and by back then I'm talking about 5,000 years or so, if you want to believe mainstream history, the bicameral mind was man had two inner dialogues, one that was his ancestors, or he attributed to his ancestors, and one that was himself. And this other mind, or this other voice, would tell him to do certain things. So, I mean, take that for what it is, but that's according to mainstream science or seance, whatever you want to call it, right? But the reason
that's the second time you've said that. Is that a thing?
That's something that I coined, to trust the seance, because it sounds the same. Right. Or my friend Cheney. So shout out to Cheney from Project Cheney. She had coined that, and I stole it from her, and I made a shirt with it and all that. So, and this segues directly into Dogman, because I believe that Crowley, out of all people, attributed Goetia. He said that was another word for howling or grunting, which is interesting, because when we think of Dogman, the first thing that you think about is werewolves. Right. And I covered probably about, I want to say a year and a half ago, I covered the Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring Gould. It's a book from the 19th century, late 19th century, where it's all about werewolves. And he attributes a lot of different people in history as to, right, this lycanthrope, some indigenous cultures would dress themselves up, do these certain dances, and transform themselves into these entities. I've also heard of it put as, right, people would do deals with the Dark One, or the devil, or Satan, and they would be granted these powers at a certain time of night. There was what I like to call the astral werewolf, where it was like a meat suit somewhere, and people would jump into it. And, that would entitle, there's werewolf meat suits sitting around somewhere. If it's interdimensional, who knows? But we always hear about Dogman coming through portals, right? And I recently went to near Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and I was near the building of where they supposedly had developed pieces of some nuclear reactor, something or other along those lines. I was on this river. I was fly fishing, and my guide was allegedly on that river. He had seen Bigfoot. So we were talking about Bigfoot, and he was telling me about the times he's seen Dogman and all this stuff. And I think I told you about that guy. So I got in touch with his brother, which I can put you in touch with his brother because he's got a paranormal channel. And so this idea that perhaps I did another episode. Again, I do so much research on familiars, and the idea that tormented souls are reincarnated as dogs. Okay. Now stick with me because we're going to get a little bit crazy, but in my recent research that I did, he came across this he said some interesting things. And when I covered the tree of death, which is the opposite, right? On the backside of the tree of life. And I'm talking about Kabbalah. But one of the interesting points that he brought forth is that in one of these dimensions, one of these sephirots or tusks or husks or shells of another dimension, time moves backwards. Now, a lot of different occultists, including Jack Parsons and Crowley, were obsessed with the crossing of the abyss. And what the crossing of the abyss was this ritual that they would do to invoke the nameless one or the bornless one ritual, where they would dissolve their ego in order to become all powerful, right? This ritual. Now, in one of these dimensions, right? You know, the tree of life, you got the different sephirots, there's different realms, different dimensions. Yeah. In one of them, time moves backwards. And Kenneth Grant in his book talks about how they believed, these occultists were obsessed with transgressing their consciousness to before human times into a larval existence. Right. And this ties into some whole other stuff that I was looking into with Carl Jung and all this stuff. But to leave all that out of it, he talks about how the magical lycanthrope, so the werewolf, is attributed to when an occultist fails this crossing of the abyss and is kicked into the abyss by the ape-headed dog. Okay. And we know that there's different forms of the dog man, right? There's different, they attribute different shapes to their face and all this stuff. So the ape-headed dog is what they referred to it, would watch them struggle and kick them into the abyss. And therefore they would lose their mind. They would go insane. And that was a contributing factor to this magical lycanthrope phenomenon and other phenomenons that are related to it. Now, if we believe that tormented souls, or maybe these souls that didn't pass the test of crossing the abyss, and maybe they're reincarnated through another dimension of some other and come into this realm as a dog person or whatever it may be, I just found it interesting that he relates, right, the losing of your mind to the dogman or werewolf. Because if we look at certain occult aspects like Kundalini, for example, right, when people awaken their Kundalini, well, it's all about invoking a biological change within themselves through the use of the occult. Through the awakening of the Kundalini, I've heard it changes people physically. Well, let's take a simpler concept. The placebo effect. What does that do? The placebo effect is magic. And it's the type of magic that you want. You want to invoke a change without having to actually do it. You want to manifest a change without actually having to do anything. And what does the placebo effect do? Quite literally changes people's biology. Through what? Through the use of the mind. Yeah. Through their belief, therefore enhances their biology. So, with all that said, it wouldn't be too far-fetched if certain occultists or certain governmental agencies tapped into this technology in order to use the Dogman or something similar for whatever purposes that they want. We remember, right, as of recently, the Ukraine war and all this stuff. Well, if I recall correctly, there was an article that people kind of brushed off. They were talking about super soldiers. You hear about that?
Yeah.
The soldiers that they would shoot at and they wouldn't go down. Well, Skinwalker Ranch, what do we hear about the werewolves out there?
And I only saw that referenced once, and I could never find it again.
You got it. Absolutely. I couldn't find it ever again, but it was there because this is going to be really weird, Eric. Bear with me. In this 9th century grimoire that I recently acquired a translation of, I can't say anything else because I'm working on a huge project right now. Not until that comes out am I able to say anything about it, but I'm going to be covering it. I got a firsthand translation, but one of the funnier aspects of this grimoire, and it shows you recipes on how to create a homunculus or a rational animal, if you will. One of the aspects of that is, this is going to sound really weird, Eric, but stay with me. You need to beat a cow carcass to a pulp, and this is traced back to an ancient Greek practice. But you need to beat the carcass of a cow to a pulp with the biggest dog penis you can find. Okay? Sounds crazy, Eric. I know you probably want to laugh, but hear me out. That's a peculiar thing to say.
It's very specific.
Very specific. Now, I recently had on Chris Matthew, and part of my show, I involve comedy in it because I do think that where we talk about heavy topics, you need to laugh a little bit, right? I have people write to me all the time like, hey, man, I was in the zone listening to you and you busted out some random joke and I just bursted out laughing and I enjoyed it more because you're able to cut that tension with the comedic insertion. Well, what if this Dogman phenomenon has to do with this technology that they were tapping into back then? And again, that's a very specific thing to say. But everybody always focuses, and I don't know about you, you've heard more stories than I have, but does anybody ever mention to you the genitalia of these dogmen or Bigfoot? Do we ever hear anything on that?
There are references. It's not all the time, but there are stories, there are experiencers that will reference, like the gentleman I had, I believe the episode was called Attacked in East Texas. He was early morning. He was on his way to a gun show. He was a gun dealer. He was driving up into East Texas, had to relieve himself early in the morning. So he pulled off the side of the road into a landing where you could launch your boats. Got out of his truck, walked over to the edge of the wood line and unzipped and started to relieve himself. And he got snatched by an arm that came out from underneath the bush, grabbed him by the back of the ankle, pulled him down, and apparently took him for what he approximated as to be about 100 yards into the woods. At that point, the thing dropped his leg, turned around to face him, and it was a 8.5 foot Sasquatch, and he pulled his double barrel shotgun that he had strapped to his leg in a custom holster, and he said he put the barrels of that right between his navel and his penis. So, there are some, Patty from the Patterson-Gimlin film, quite obviously has breasts. It's not something you hear a lot of, but there are references.
Because the reason I bring this up, and again, this is a very weird place to take the conversation, but the reason I bring that up is because as of recently, if we're to take all these grimoires literally, how I believe that a lot of these elites and people in secret circles are, they're taking these recipes, and there are various recipes, by the way, some that get even more macabre, or however you want to, I think that's how you say it, or more dark. And so this is one of the more tame ones, but the exotic animal penis market is a real one. And if we're to take the lure, I mean, as of recently, I saw too, out of Nigeria going to China, there was a shipment of a whole bunch of donkey penises that was confiscated. Now, what they use those for, I don't know, but I just thought it was because part of those recipes is also to turn yourself into an ape, which I just recently covered the divine ape and its symbolism to these occultists. They revere the ape, and turning yourself into one, and not only just an ape, but turning yourself into or others into chimeras as well. This grimoire, this particular grimoire, the Liber Vitae, which is from the 9th century, there's 15 different translations, one of which John Dee had a copy of, by the way, right? Queen Elizabeth's astrologer. So it comes full circle, where these elitists or these occultists have this knowledge, and they're reading these things. And the scariest part about it is that the creator of the concept of the homunculus, to bring it full circle, was Paracelsus. Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim is his name.
Jesus,
AKA
I thought
Paracelsus.
my last name was bad.
No, this is the dude's name. But he's not just some regular Joe Schmo, Eric. He's the father of modern day toxicology. So he's the guy that was able to find out if you give a person too much morphine, they die. If you give them too little, they feel everything. So the dose makes the poison. Just enough will put them right under and they won't feel anything. Now, he is also, a lot has been attributed to him. He contributed a lot of ideas to surgery as well. We're talking about a guy in the 16th century, one of the greatest minds of all time. And he's the one that brought forth the idea of the homunculus through his writings. So these are high-level people in society. Now, whether that be intellectual or not, because he was addicted to opioids, and he's a very intriguing character if you look into his history. But point being that the highest minds, it makes you think of, if you want to think of them as high, Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, or all these people in society who we look up to, who might be into these weird ideas. And that's where I like to bring things full circle. I like to give people the history and the history lesson, and then kind of bring in the modern. It's like, oh, well, where is it in modern time? Well, here it is. I mean, there's an article, you can look it up. Jeff Bezos looking for the elixir of life. They want to tap into immortality. You had, as of lately, Ecto Labs. They want to have a whole bunch of babies created in incubators and false matrices. So seems like sci-fi until it's not, right? I mean, it's a conspiracy theory until it's not. And then what? But I believe that they're tapping into this. And I do think that they were doing genetic splicing and genetic experiments back then. There are recipes to make chimeras. And if you look at a Bigfoot or a Dogman, or you have your pick, the rake or the whatever, the Mothman, anything that we see that in history. We see that in Roman times, depictions of that. We see that in Egyptian times, where they do these hieroglyphs of, right, these dog-headed men and all these different things. So I think that there is some truth to that. Now, if they're coming from another dimension and being birthed from the failed attempts of these occultists to cross this abyss through whichever magical system that they're using, could possibly be, because again, that's one of the concepts that Kenneth Grant taps into, and I do think that this is what they put in these movies. And one of my favorite examples is Stranger Things. I mean, I think a lot of people have seen that, and I think it kind of works like that, Eric. I don't know.
Do you think, so going back to playing the devil's advocate, do you think that there is a possibility? I mean, we've talked about a lot of weird stuff, right? Especially when we start getting into the things that may or may not be coming from other dimensions, and, the chimeric stuff, and Bigfoot and Dogman and all these weird cryptids. Do you think there's a possibility that there could be some an overactive amount of ego in these occultists that are trying to attribute some claim to themselves by bringing this up, when in reality, my argument isn't that these things don't exist, because I truly do believe that they do. I just think that they are more natural. They exist. We don't know why. We don't know anything about where they come from, how they come. They just exist. They're with us, and whether it's on a different dimension, a different plane, if we can only see them when a veil is thin, they're there. Do you think there's a possibility that these occultists throughout history have had the ego enough about them to try to take on the fact that those things are them when we failed at doing what we ultimately wanted to do?
I do think that there is a natural aspect to it. Absolutely. I believe it's autonomous, and it could be a little bit of both. It could be that that's why I called it a technology, Eric, because I think that these occultists in particular were maybe able to tap into that technology, and these things exist on the other side, and they're not, some might slip through on their own naturally, right? Or some people could be bringing them into this. I mean, I think it was what Merkel talked about, how he was listening to that guy, the YouTuber, forget his name, the guy with the little beanie. Anyways, he was listening to one of his shows, and they had a witch there that talked about bringing forth these dogmen or werewolves into this dimension. They were opening portals. Yeah. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think that these things exist autonomously. And to add to the fire, if you will, you have Carl Jung, who talked about the collective conscious. He talked about a lot of aspects in reality. The UFO, for example, is a projection of our subconscious as a collective. So if we all think about it all at the same time, it kind of comes into our reality. It crosses over. And Henry Corbin, which was a contemporary, and I believe he studied with a pupil of Carl Jung, I could be getting that part wrong, he had a concept of what he called the mundus imaginalis, which was, and I think there's a reasoning, again, back to this perversion or dilution of imagination, right? They always say that kids have this crazy imagination. They're able to think up of anything. Well, I think they just tell us to, as a kid, they told us to use your imagination. Then when you grow up, they kind of don't tell you that anymore, right? Well, I think that has some power. And the reason I bring this up, because the mundus imaginalis is this world that gushes forth from your imagination that you're able to tap into through certain technologies, scrying being one of them, and that exists on its own. It's an autonomous world with an unlimited, it's unconstrained by reality itself. So think of reality as a computer program. Well, you can't run a Mac program on a Windows PC. Same with reality. You can't do certain things unless it's programmed into it, or you know how to bypass that. And that's why I think that these occultists use certain numbers, so gematria, numerology, and all these different things that they use to kind of sort of hack that matrix, if you will, for a lack of a better term. But this mundus imaginalis exists. And I mean, think of anything. There's George Luis Borges. He's an author an Argentinian author that he talked about. He wrote all these little different stories, and every single different story, it's really interesting. I encourage people to check his work out. It's very amazing. He was able to write these crazy stories, these amazing stories they're kind of like thought experiments in a way. Just these abstracted, these short little stories. And people always wondered how he was able to come up with these ideas and these concepts. And he was able to come up with these ideas because he had a very severe case of insomnia. and he existed and lived his life in a kind of half awake, half sleeping state. Most of his entire life, he had like one eye open. He was, his health was declining, but it was because he wasn't getting sleep.
Right.
So he was kind of able to tap into this dream world, or this dreamscape, and bring those ideas. And then while he was kind of half in, half out, and I know occultists who use psychedelics in micro doses to where they're able to exist in this fairy world or fairy realm and the real world, whatever that is now. And they were kind of, they're kind of able to do their magical practices to that. They tell me it aids them in their ceremonies or whatever. But point being that George Luis Borges was able to tap into these abstract concepts because he was living in these two dimensions at once, essentially. So he was able to come up with the craziest story. I mean, you got to read them to really grasp it. But like this, he writes, for example, there was a coin that, on one side it would disappear, and then on one side it was, had a face on it, and then, the king or whatever loses it, right? Because one day they're flipping the coin and it falls on the floor to never be found again because it flipped on the side that was like invisible, whatever. That's one of them. There's also another one where it's like everything that you would ever know existed in one point in time. And again, it's very poetic the way he breaks it down. I'm butchering it now, but point being that he was able to tap into these concepts because he existed in these two different realms. And we have people who talk about the dream world being this other reality. We all accept that when we go to sleep every single day, we wake up the same, that we wake up to the same people. We're trusting by us going to sleep, we wake up the same. Do we truly know if we wake up the same or not?
Yeah.
What happens when we go to sleep? There's days where I go to sleep and I wake up like I didn't even sleep. What was I doing?
Yeah. Or you go to bed and you lay down and you fall asleep right away, and you wake up an hour and a half later and you'd swear you'd have 8.5 hours of sleep and everything you were ready to go. And it's like, shit, it's not even midnight yet.
Time is different, right? Time is different for all of us. And I think we experience this reality differently. All of us, right? We all have our own experiences. And I think the truth is stranger than fiction. And I mean, I talked about a lot of weird concepts, but hey, I mean, feel free to look up a lot of them. Look up homunculus. I've done numerous presentations on it, and I cite my sources. So I'm not making this up, Eric.
Yeah. No, I don't believe you are. It is just, it is such a strange, it's no more strange than entertaining the belief that there's extraterrestrials or any of the other things that we talk about. I mean, I've been in a place that has obviously had some kind of spiritual interactions in it, and I've felt it, I've witnessed it, I've had interactions with it via certain devices. Could it be coincidental? Absolutely. Could it be absolutely nothing to do with paranormal? Sure. Could it be paranormal? Sure. I mean, the things you talk about, we said that at the beginning of the show, we're in the same genre. Your desk is in one corner of the room and my desk is on the other corner of the room. We can wave and say, how you doing today? But those two don't necessarily mix on a daily basis. But nonetheless, any less interesting, and bizarre. I mean, some of the things like, I have a personal issue with like gematria and numerology. I think I had one gentleman on quite a long time ago, and I prefaced this early on. I said, before we start recording, my show is not it's audio only. I said, so you are not going to have an opportunity to have a blackboard or a dry erase board to show what you're talking about when it comes to this. And without a visual visual aid, gematria and numerology it does not translate well into an audio broadcast. There's way too much. but at the same time, I feel, and this is a personal belief, I feel like it's pretty, I'm not going to say easy, but I will say it. I think you can draw correlations. I think you can draw, you can find associations in numbers with other things if you're looking for it. If you're, so to me, that's one of those weird ones. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying that it isn't valid, but for me personally, it's like, even with astrology and stuff, I'm like, yeah, I don't know. And I've always kind of felt that way. And it wasn't up until very recently, a good friend of mine had put in an awful lot of work into, whatever it is when you tell them, what time you were born, where you were located, what day it was, and they go through the whole thing. And I have to say, there were some things that were like way off, but there were a lot of things that were like, holy shit, man.
Spot on.
That is me to a T. And even to the point where it was like uncomfortable for me to admit it, because it's things that I typically don't like to admit about myself. But it was like, damn, that was, so I think there is something to it. But unless you have the right person with the right background behind it, explaining it, I think it can be a little off-putting. But no, your stuff is interesting, and I find myself listening to your episodes, and I get lost because I don't drive around in those circles, right? I recognize a lot of commonality. I recognize a lot of things that will take me back to conversations that I've had with people, and I was like, oh, I wonder if that's what was going on here, or, So I enjoy your show. You do a fantastic job, and I can't imagine the amount of time that you dedicate to research on this stuff. I know at a point when, just like with Bigfoot stuff, you've been doing it for years and years and years. There's a lot of knowledge you can retain, and it makes you sound like you really know what the hell you're talking about, but you're just, you've saturated yourself with that for so long that it comes naturally and easy to talk about. But I do give you kudos. You do seem to put an awful lot of research behind what you say. And, I think it's fine to, just like when I was on your show and I started talking about, the idea that Bigfoot maybe uses frequency from their vocal capabilities to affect how we view them. Maybe that's what makes them blurry. Maybe that's what makes them look like we can't see them, or when they disappear. Maybe it's just a frequency that's affecting that, that very small spectrum that our eyes can see in. It's wonderful. And I mean that in the aspect of it's wondrous,
Yeah.
The bizarre things that we get to talk about, the weirdness, the lines that we get to draw from one thing to another when we've steeped ourselves in this stuff for so long that, I think it's, you and I, we're podcast hosts, right? We're not having scientific papers in journals being reviewed by our peers, but when you make those, and I guess you'd have to call them personal revelations, to me, those are the things that it's like, wow, that makes more sense than anything I've heard up until this point. So kudos to you for
absolutely.
what you're doing.
Appreciate it. Likewise.
Do me a favor. Let's wrap this up. We're almost at 2 hours. Let everybody know where they can find your show, how they can get a hold of the writings that you do, and whatever you have coming up on the horizon here.
Absolutely. I had a blast, Eric. Thank you for having me on, man. And I had a great time the first time around I had you on my show, so I encourage people to check that episode out too. That was a great episode. And you can find me tjojp.com, and most of my social medias are at the Juan on Juan podcast on pretty much any social media platform, any form of that. Usually the pod at the end is either PD or POD. And yeah, I have a publication that I do on Occultist Monday. It's various esoteric and occult subjects, and you can get that on my website, tjojp.com. I do have a Patreon as well that you can find me on, patreon.com/the Juan on Juan podcast. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Rockfin, Rumble, everywhere. Quite literally, I'll send you my link tree, and people can have their pick of where they want to follow me. You can find me anywhere in any major podcast platform. I do a couple episodes a week, sometimes more. But yeah, I for the people who are going to come over, it is sort of like a think tank, because what happens is, and this is my philosophy, I talk about what I like, what I find interesting, whatever my obsession may be at that week and point in time, whatever it is, I talk about it. So it's reflections of my digestion of ideas and concepts that obviously a lot of them can get heavy. A lot of them can get complicated, but I mean, that's what we're here for. We're here to shift paradigms and open up people's eyes to the Occultist Monday, which quite literally means the hidden world. So I do think that there is a reality over late hours, and that's why I named it that. But truth is stranger than fiction, Eric, and I enjoy your podcast from time to time. I use it as my guilty pleasure is cryptids, and I listen to cryptid podcasts whenever I'm taking a break from research, because it will drive you insane. As you said earlier, if you look into the abyss will stare right back into you. And for anybody who's going to be looking into these sort of things, I warn them to, do it from, make sure you're in a good space, because it can get hot and heavy really quickly. Just be careful, you know what I mean? And I always tell everybody, be a good person,
don't
love
go
each
astray.
other.
Don't go astray.
Exactly. I appreciate you, Eric. Thank you, man.
Appreciate you, Juan. It's been a pleasure having you on, man. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Good night. Well, that's it for tonight's show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Juan Ayala, the host of the Juan on Juan podcast. Please, if you enjoyed tonight's show, go check out his content. Give him some love. He's got a lot of great content out there. Check out his efforts, please. Don't forget to head over to patreon.com/uncomfortable podcast 770 and see if any of the membership levels appeal to you. Don't forget to pick up the Uncomfortable Discord server link in the shows below. Again, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, both at Uncomfortable Podcast 65. If you've got a story or have had an experience that you would like to have aired on the show, please get a hold of me at contact.uncomfortable@gmail.com. And please, make sure to share the show in any way you can. That's what grows podcasts like this. Share it with your friends, family, coworkers. That's the main thing that you can do to help continue to grow this show and get it out in front of more people. Thanks for joining me. I will see you next week. And as always, stay uncomfortable, my friends.
Meet Zach. His work-life balance is anything but balanced. But when he gets on the bike, he becomes Zen Zach. Zen Zach exists outside of time. His heartbeat sounds like a mellow drum circle.
It's cool, right?
The only notification he hears is the sound of the ocean. So if you want to reach him, talk to the ocean. Zen Zach is so zen because he has 24/7 expert claim service with Geico, which is totally chill. Geico Motorcycle, expert coverage for both your sides.
Are you struggling to lose weight and keep it off? Tired of wasting time and money on starvation diets that lead to more frustration and stress? If there was a weight loss solution that could actually work for you, would you try it? Then head to Golo.com.
I'm Steve. I lost 138 pounds in 9 months on Golo.
I'm Amber. I've lost 128 pounds with Golo Taking Release.
If you're ready to take back control of your life, head to Golo.com now and see how Golo can work for you. That's GOLO.com.
My sleep is way better. My inflammation has gone way down. Golo saved my life. I was way overweight. That's what sent me down the path. I wanted to make sure and live for my kid.
I have literally tried everything. I was on the verge of getting gastric bypass surgery, and I saw the Golo commercial, and it was the last thing I tried because it worked.
Join over 2 million people who have found a better way to lose weight with Golo. Your healthier and happier life begins at Golo.com. That's GOLO.com. Again, GOLO.com.